The sun dipped low over the horizon, bleeding crimson into the sky. Dust clung to the wind like old secrets, sweeping across the desolate trail where Samuel Wade rode alone. His horse, a tired sorrel with a limp in its step, snorted at the heat. The silence of the plains stretched, broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves, until a sound, faint and brittle, caught Samuel's ear. A cry. He reined in, every muscle in his body tensing. The wind carried it again, thin, high-pitched, unmistakably human. A baby's cry. Samuel scanned the scrubland, eyes narrowing. He dismounted swiftly, boots crunching over brittle brush and scorched earth, as he followed the sound down a shallow ravine. There, nestled beneath a dying mesquite and half buried by drifting dust, lay a bundle. A rough woolen shawl blood-stained at the edge. The cries faltered as Samuel knelt beside it, breath-catching. He pulled the cloth aside and stared. A baby, swaddled in rags, eyes wide with fright and hunger. A girl's brooch, tarnished silver, was pinned to the cloth. Her cheeks were streaked with tears and dirt. Samuel's rough hands trembled as he lifted the child, feeling the fragile weight of a life placed carelessly in the hands of fate. He stood there for a moment, rooted in place, wind tugging at his coat. Ghosts stirred in the back of his mind, screams from a battlefield, the cries of his own lost child, buried far from here in Georgia soil. He looked at the baby again. The past echoed, sharp and unbearable. No note, no trail, just a child abandoned in the wild. He knew what he had to do. Dry Hollow sat 20 miles east, a dried-up mining town with more ghosts than living souls. There, if anyone, lived Grace Langley, the widow with the iron spine and sorrowful eyes. If anyone could keep a child alive, it was her. Samuel didn't speak as he rode, the child wrapped against his chest, her cries subsiding into hiccups and sighs. The trail stretched on, moonlight rising to light his path, stars cold and endless overhead. By dawn, he reached the edge of Dry Hollow. The town barely stirred. Wind rattled old signs. Samuel dismounted before the general store and knocked on the wooden door. A moment later it creaked open. Grace stood there, robe tied at her waist, hair unpinned. Her eyes met his, then dropped to the bundle. Surprise flickered, followed by something unreadable. "I found her out west of Dalton's Hill," Samuel said simply. "Alone." Grace's gaze hardened. "What do you expect me to do?" "Raise her. Or she dies. Before we find out who this child truly is and how destiny twists lives, make sure to subscribe for more incredible true tales from the Old West. This one's just getting started." She stared at him a long moment, then opened the door wider. Samuel stepped back, laying the baby in her arms. Grace said nothing. She closed the door behind her. Samuel turned without another word and disappeared into the dawn. Grace Langley stared down at the child cradled in her arms. The baby had stopped crying, her face calm now, tiny fingers curled against Grace's robe. But Grace's heart raced with a tight, uncertain rhythm. She hadn't held a child in years, not since Thomas. Her fingers grazed the blood-stained edge of the shawl. Old memories surged like a flood. Nights she'd rocked her boy to sleep, the day he died in that cave-in while hunting quartz for the mine bosses who never sent a letter of apology. Her life since then had been quiet, bitter, efficient. No room for softness, no room for ghosts. She glanced up at the door Samuel Wade had just stepped through. He was gone, of course. The man was always more shadow than flesh. He'd come into Dry Hollow every few months, silent, watchful, never staying long. Folks said he worked bounties, tracked wanted men across the plains, kept to himself. Grace never asked. She understood the weight of silence. She looked back down at the child. "Who left you?" she murmured. "And why?" The baby whimpered in her sleep. Grace sighed. She laid her down gently in the wooden crate she once used for storing onions, lined it with a towel. She fed the girl a bit of goat milk warmed over the stove, and when that was done, she sat in her rocker, staring into the flickering lantern light. By midday, word had spread. Curious neighbors wandered into the store under pretenses, buying nails, salt, dried beans, but they all stared at the bundle in the corner. "You taking her in, Grace?" Old Man Wilkins asked. She didn't answer, just rang up his flour and moved on. That night, after closing up shop, she stood at the back window watching the horizon. The sky had gone a deep violet, the wind calmer now. Her hands trembled without permission. She opened the front door on a hunch. There on the porch rail sat a small wooden rattle, carefully carved, sanded smooth. A single etching on the handle, a feather. She picked it up and held it to the light. Samuel, no doubt. He hadn't said goodbye. He never did. But that rattle said more than words ever could. It was a promise, maybe, or a warning. She wasn't sure. Inside, the baby stirred. Grace turned and walked back in, rattle in hand. She knelt beside the crate and placed it gently beside the child. "You're not mine," she whispered, "but you're here, and that means something." The girl blinked sleepily as if hearing. Grace leaned back, crossed her arms, and watched her for a long while. Something soft and strange stirred deep in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a dozen winters. It terrified her, but she didn't look away. Years passed like sand through an hourglass, slow and steady. The child, once abandoned in a dust-choked ravine, now ran laughing through the wooden alleys of Dry Hollow. Grace named him Eli. She never told anyone why she chose it. It had just come to her one night like a whisper from the wind. Eli grew fast, wild-haired and sharp-eyed. By 6, he could read signs on the crates, stack shelves, and skin a rabbit. Grace taught him to work, to think before speaking, to hold his chin up even when his knees trembled. She didn't coddle, but she never let him doubt he was hers. Still, questions came. "Where's my real ma?" he'd asked once, no more than 5, hands sticky from honey. Grace had paused, wiped his mouth, and said, "She couldn't stay. So I did." That was enough for a while. The town watched him grow, some with kindness, others with cold suspicion. Children at the schoolhouse whispered about him being a foundling, a stray. Eli fought when he had to, took beatings when he didn't. Grace never scolded him for defending himself, only for breaking a boy's nose too cleanly. Each winter, Samuel Wade returned. He never said he would. He just showed up, tired horse, trail dust on his coat, a weak stubble on his chin. He brought no words, only little things. A harmonica, a feather carved from redwood, a pair of boots 2 sizes too big that Eli would one day grow into. The boy began waiting for him, sitting on the porch in late October, hoping to see that lean figure riding in from the ridge. When he did, he grinned like a fool. Samuel never stayed long. He'd tie his horse outside, say few words to Grace, share a quiet meal, then vanish before dawn. But each time Eli learned a little more. How to set a snare, how to tell deer tracks from coyote, how to read the sky before a storm. Grace watched all this unfold with a mix of gratitude and dread. Samuel was good to the boy, steady in his way. But he was still a man of blood, still marked by the things he wouldn't speak of. One evening, as the first stars broke through the dusk, Eli sat beside her on the porch steps. He held a small leather pouch Samuel had given him that day. "Do you think he's my pa?" Eli asked. Grace's heart clenched, but her face stayed still. "No," she said, "but he might be something just as important." Eli nodded, quiet, the way children do when they're still too young to name their feelings. That night, long after he'd gone to bed, Grace stayed up watching the empty road, wondering if Samuel would come back again. She knew he would. Dry Hollow had always carried a thin layer of tension beneath its dust. But by the time Eli turned 10, that tension began to thicken like smoke before fire. Sheriff Wallace Greaves had worn the star for 6 years. Broad-shouldered, always smiling too wide, he shook hands with ranchers and poured drinks for outlaws. He claimed to keep order, but most knew he kept his pockets full instead. Greaves had aligned himself with the McAllisters, the land barons trying to buy up every inch of Dry Hollow's outskirts. Grace Langley naturally refused to sell. Her store sat on a plot of land they wanted, right where the old rail line was rumored to pass if the expansion ever came. Grace wouldn't budge. Said her husband was buried out back beneath the cottonwood tree and she wasn't about to leave him for silver promises. That didn't sit well with Greaves. One morning Eli woke to the sharp scent of smoke. He burst from bed to find the rear shed, where they stored grain and old tools, engulfed in flames. Grace and two neighbors were already beating it down with wet blankets and sand. They saved the store, but the shed collapsed in cinders. The sheriff arrived late, looking sleepy. "Could be lightning," he offered, eyes flicking over the wreckage. "There wasn't a cloud last night," Grace said. He smiled. "Well then, maybe kids. Reckless these days." He left without offering help. Grace didn't reply, but Eli saw her knuckles turn white around the broom handle. That week, Samuel returned. He rode in at dusk, same as always. Eli ran to greet him, eager to tell him everything. Samuel listened, crouched beside the boy, one hand resting on his shoulder. "Fire don't just start itself," Samuel said. "Not out here." Grace stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. "You think it was him?" Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Over the next few days, Samuel lingered longer than usual. He wandered town, spoke to the blacksmith, the farrier, even quiet Marta who ran the boarding house. Word came in hushed tones. Greaves was leaning on others too, offering gold for land, for silence. At night, he carved a little horse for Eli and taught him to tie knots used by scouts and rangers. The boy soaked up every detail. Grace watched from the window, heart heavy. The man was preparing him for something, though he didn't say what. One evening after dinner, Eli turned to Samuel. "You ever kill a man who wasn't bad?" Samuel looked him in the eye. "Yes." "Did it feel different?" Samuel paused, then shook his head. "No, it just stayed longer." The wind blew through the open window. Grace didn't speak, but she knew what was coming. The world outside their door was shifting, and trouble, real trouble, was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived. The knock came just after noon, when the sun was highest and the town quiet with heat. Grace was slicing bread, Eli stacking canned goods on the shelf. She opened the door with a cloth still wrapped around her hand. A stranger stood there, tall, polished boots, a city coat dusty from the trail. His mustache was neat, his gaze cool and calculating. He held a leather satchel under one arm. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "name's Edgar Flint. I believe you're raising a boy named Eli." Grace didn't answer. Eli stepped beside her, instinctively reaching for her skirt. "I've come to take him home," Flint said, holding up a folded paper. "I'm his uncle, brother to his late mother. I have the documentation to prove it." Grace's face hardened. "I didn't know his ma had a brother," she said slowly. "Neither did she. We were estranged, but blood is blood." He handed her the paper. It bore signatures, a seal, names she recognized only faintly, surnames that had shown up on the baby's brooch. A judge's stamp from Fort Bridger. "I filed for custody," Flint said smoothly. "You'll be receiving a summons soon." Eli looked up at her, wide-eyed. Grace folded the paper without reading the fine print. "He's not going anywhere. We'll let the courts decide." The man tipped his hat again and walked away, boots clicking sharply on the boards. The summons arrived 2 days later. Eli couldn't sleep. He tried to be brave, but the fear clung to him. Grace stayed up each night, candles burning low, reading the document over and over. It was legitimate, or at least it looked it. Samuel returned without being called. He found Grace sitting on the porch, staring into the dark. "You here already?" she asked. "I hear things." He took the paper, eyes scanning fast. Then he folded it and handed it back. "This man's not kin," he said. "This is dressed-up fraud." Grace sighed. "But it looks clean. For now." Samuel didn't sleep that night. He left before sunrise without a word, taking only his rifle and a worn notebook. Eli watched from the upstairs window, eyes wide with a mix of dread and admiration. At school, kids whispered. Some adults began to distance themselves, wary of getting pulled into trouble with Greaves and his men. A few townsfolk offered quiet support, but most turned their heads. Fear had a way of making good people forget their courage. Eli walked into the store one afternoon and slammed a book on the counter. "I'm not going with him," he said. Grace didn't argue. Instead, she reached for the little rattle Samuel had carved, now kept in a drawer. She placed it beside the book. "Then we stand together." The boy nodded. Whatever came next, neither of them would face it alone. Samuel rode hard, cutting east across the plains, his mind heavy with names and fragments. He'd seen Flint's type before: smooth talk, fancy ink, hidden knives. That document was forged, he was certain, but proving it would take more than suspicion. He arrived in Bent Creek by dusk, a ramshackle town with a courthouse barely standing. There a clerk owed him favors. Over cheap whiskey and quiet threats, Samuel got what he needed: records of land ownership disputes, mentions of the McAllisters, and a death notice that chilled him. Eli's real family hadn't just disappeared, they'd been murdered. 12 years ago, a homestead west of Dalton's Hill was attacked, torched in the night, livestock butchered, a young woman and man killed. Only a child was unaccounted for. Locals called it a land feud. McAllister names appeared in testimonies but were never charged. Flint wasn't family, he was an agent, hired to clean up the past and seal new deals. Samuel rode back through the night, mind fixed on the boy's eyes, on Grace's quiet strength. He carried the documents like a weapon, the truth sharp enough to cut through any lie. Grace met him at the door. "Well?" she asked. "They killed his family," Samuel said simply. "Now they want to finish the job." He laid the evidence on the table. Grace didn't weep. She just looked out the window, eyes steely. "Then we make them stop." Samuel hesitated. "If I testify, I'll have to tell them where I was, what I did back then. I'm not a clean man, Grace." "I know," she said, "but you're a true one." He looked at her, that unshakable woman with her sleeves rolled up and a storm behind her eyes. He nodded. Eli stood in the doorway, quiet. "I want to know everything," he said. So Samuel told him, about the war, about the scouts and the raids, about losing his wife and daughter to fever, about finding a baby in the dirt and not walking away. Eli listened, not blinking. "You done bad things," the boy said. Samuel lowered his gaze. "Yes." "But you saved me." Samuel looked up, startled. "That's more than most men ever do," Eli said. The three sat in silence, the weight of history pressing down on them, but something had shifted, like a bone finally set right. They weren't just standing together now. They were preparing to fight. That evening, Grace pulled out the Sunday dress she'd buried in a trunk. Eli practiced speaking clearly, proudly. Samuel sat at the table, writing his own name down on a fresh affidavit, hand steady. Outside, the wind stirred the dust, and the sky turned the color of steel. The trial was coming, and this time Samuel Wade wouldn't be a shadow. He'd stand in the light, no matter what it burned away. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and sweat. It was the largest room in Dry Hollow, once a church, now turned to civil use. Every bench was filled, townsfolk, ranchers, curious drifters. They'd come not just to see justice, but to measure its cost. Judge Ambrose, old and grey-eyed, presided in silence. He'd seen cattle thieves hanged and widows robbed blind. This case was different. It had weight. Edgar Flint stood at the plaintiff's table, papers neatly stacked, suit pressed. Grace sat beside Eli, their hands linked beneath the table. Samuel stood behind them, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. Flint made his case first, eloquent, practiced. He presented the papers, spun tales of lost bloodlines, a grieving family desperate to reclaim one of its own. He painted Grace as stubborn, unfit, clinging to what was not hers. Then it was their turn. Samuel stepped forward. The courtroom hushed. He removed his hat, cleared his throat. "My name is Samuel Wade. 12 years ago I found a child abandoned in the ravine outside Dalton's Hill. No note, no family, just blood and dust." He handed the affidavit to the judge. Then he pulled another document from his coat, a report from Bent Creek, yellowed but intact. "This here's the record of a land massacre. 2 dead, 1 child missing. No survivors except this boy." Gasps rippled through the benches. Flint shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Samuel continued, voice steady. "This man, Flint, is no uncle, He's an agent, working for the same folks who ordered that killing. I've got names, records, even land filings that connect the dots." Flint stood shouting objections. The judge banged his gavel once, hard. "Let him finish." Samuel turned to the benches. "I'm no saint. I fought a dirty war. I've taken lives I can't give back. But I swore I'd protect this boy, and that's what I'm doing now." He stepped back. Then Eli stood. The room quieted again, surprised. He looked straight at the judge. His voice cracked but didn't falter. "I don't know who that man is," he said, pointing at Flint. "But I know who raised me. Grace Langley is my ma, always has been. She fed me, taught me right from wrong. She held me when I cried. That's what matters." The judge stared at him, unreadable. "And Samuel?" the judge asked. Eli turned, eyes shining. "He saved me, even before I knew what that meant." Silence stretched thick. Then the judge nodded slowly, like a mountain considering an avalanche. "I've heard enough." And just like that, the gavel struck wood. One verdict had been spoken, but outside those doors, another storm was already gathering. The courtroom emptied in a hush. No one spoke loudly. The verdict had fallen like thunder, and its echo clung to the walls. Grace held Eli close as they stepped out into the daylight, Samuel trailing just behind them. Outside, Sheriff Wallace Greaves stood by the hitching post, arms folded, chewing on a toothpick. His face bore no expression, but his eyes were knives. Flint was gone, vanished before the ink dried. "You made quite the scene in there," Greaves said to Samuel. "We told the truth," Samuel replied. "If that's a scene, then maybe you've forgotten what justice looks like." Greaves spat into the dirt. "Truth don't mean much when money's louder." The threat was clear. They rode home in silence. Grace knew better than to believe things were over. Men like Greaves didn't lose easily, and they never lost quietly. That night, Dry Hollow erupted. Someone fired shots into the front of the general store. Glass shattered. Eli dropped to the floor as Grace pulled him behind the counter. Samuel returned fire from the porch, calm and steady. The attackers fled into the darkness, hooves kicking dust into the moonlight. The next morning, the store was a wreck. Samuel found a warning carved into the post: "Leave or burn." Grace stood over it, jaw tight. Eli clenched his fists. "We stay," he said. Samuel nodded. "Then we fight smart." They boarded windows, reinforced the doors, spoke quietly to allies. The blacksmith offered extra nails. Marta from the boarding house brought food. Others turned away, pretending nothing was wrong. Fear had returned. 2 nights later, Greaves came himself. He arrived alone, no badge, no smile. He stood outside the store and called out to Samuel by name. "You got one chance to ride out. Take the boy, take the woman, leave the land." Samuel stepped outside, rifle slung low, hands open. "Not leaving. Then you're dying." It happened fast. Greaves drew first, but Samuel moved like lightning, dropping to one knee, firing once. The bullet caught Greaves in the thigh. He roared, stumbled, then raised his revolver again. A second shot rang out, not from Samuel but from behind. Grace stood in the doorway holding her old hunting rifle. Her hands didn't shake. Greaves fell. He didn't die, but he didn't rise either. Word spread fast. By dawn, folks were whispering. By noon, the mayor stripped Greaves of his badge. Flint's claim was declared fraudulent. And Dry Hollow, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to its people again. Eli helped clean the broken shelves, sweeping glass into a pan. Grace cooked stew for the neighbors who dared to return. Samuel stood outside watching the road. He wasn't smiling, but he stayed. Dry Hollow settled back into itself, like a wound slowly scabbing over. The broken windows were replaced. The scorch marks faded. Greaves was taken to Fort Bridger in irons, his leg shattered and his reputation worse. Flint was never seen again. The store reopened within the week. Neighbors who once stayed silent now returned with cautious kindness, buying flour, tipping their hats, pretending they hadn't looked the other way when it counted. Grace didn't offer judgment. She just counted coins and gave exact change. Eli grew quieter after the trial. He still worked, still laughed at Samuel's dry jokes, but something deeper had taken root, an understanding too big for his age. He asked fewer questions. He listened more. One afternoon, as the sun settled soft and gold over the porch, Samuel stood whittling. Eli approached, dragging a stool beside him. "You going to leave again?" the boy asked. Samuel looked at him. "You want me to?" Eli didn't answer right away. He watched the knife turn a block of pine into a rough outline of a horse. "I think you're already part of this place," he said finally. Samuel stopped carving. "That's so?" Eli nodded. "Ma says we don't get to choose all our kin." "Some find us later." Grace watched from inside, her hands still in dough. She didn't speak, but her breath caught. Later that week, the mayor summoned them for a formal adoption hearing. A routine matter, just paperwork, but the weight of it settled on them all. In the courthouse, with sunlight streaking through high windows, Grace stood tall beside Eli. The judge, same man as before, asked her to confirm intent. She did. Then he turned to Samuel. "You're listed as witness to the boy's origin. You may stand aside if you wish." Samuel remained seated for a long moment. Then he rose. "I'd like to speak." Permission granted, he stepped forward, the room watching. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't use fine words. "I found Eli in the dirt. But I see now I didn't just find a child. I found purpose. I found a reason to stay. I found people worth staying for." He looked at Grace, then at the boy. "And if he calls her Ma, then I reckon I will too." The room held its breath. Grace blinked, lips parted. Eli smiled. Not a boy's grin, but something steadier, anchored. The judge nodded. The gavel came down. And just like that, it was done. They walked home in the hush of late afternoon. The wind blew gentle. The town bustled soft behind them. On the porch that evening, Samuel sat in his usual spot, boots crossed. Grace brought 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for him. No words passed between them. None were needed. Years passed. Dry Hollow changed, as towns always do. The rail came through, just as the McAllisters had planned. But it didn't bring what they wanted. It brought life, not control. The store expanded, took on new help. Streets got paved. A schoolhouse replaced the old saloon. And people stopped whispering about the boy who'd once been found in the dust. Eli Wade Langley became a name folks respected. He grew into his boots, his shoulders, his voice. Took over the store when Grace's hands began to stiffen. Learned how to read supply ledgers, drive a wagon through a flood, and negotiate prices with men twice his age. Grace aged like stone, solid, still, unmoved. She smiled more, but only a little. Her eyes, though, never lost their sharpness. When she finally passed, it was in her chair, fire crackling, a blanket across her lap. Eli held her hand until the last breath, and afterward he wept without shame. Samuel lingered some years longer. He never spoke of the war again, never left Dry Hollow. He kept carving things, birds, horses, canes for old men. His hands slowed, but his presence never faded. When he died, Eli buried him beneath the same cottonwood where Grace's husband lay. He carved a marker by hand. Samuel Wade, he stayed. Now Eli stood on the same porch where he'd once waited for Samuel's return. The town stretched out before him, full of people who didn't know the whole story. A few remembered pieces, but only Eli carried it all. A child left behind, a widow who opened her arms, a man running from ghosts who found something worth staying for. It wasn't about blood. It never had been. Family, Eli learned, was forged by choice, by courage, by holding the line when the world wanted you gone. He walked into the store, shelves neatly stacked. A photo of Grace behind the counter, next to Samuel's old rattle, now framed in glass. He touched it gently, then turned the sign to closed. Outside the wind stirred. It carried the dust, same as always, but now it carried memory too. Before you go, if this tale stirred your soul, if it reminded you of the power of found family, of loyalty carved from hardship, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this, waiting just down the trail. And if you're ready for another unforgettable journey through the Old West, one filled with mystery, grit, and heart, click the next video on your screen now. The dust may settle, but the echoes never fade.